August 8, 1944. 3 miles south of Caen, France. Through the commander's cupola of his Panther Ausführung G, SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann scanned the Norman countryside with the practiced eye of a man who had destroyed 138 enemy tanks. The morning belonged to Operation Totalize, the Canadian First Army's massive push to break through German lines. Wittmann's Tiger had been destroyed days earlier, replaced now with this newer Panther, a machine whose 80mm Glacis plate, sloped at 55 degrees, created an effective thickness of 139mm that no Allied tank could penetrate, or so German doctrine promised. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The summer air carried the thunder of Allied artillery and the rumble of hundreds of tank engines converging on German positions. Wittmann had faced overwhelming numbers before, at Kursk, across the Eastern Front, at Villers-Bocage just 2 months prior, where he had single-handedly destroyed over a dozen British tanks in minutes. He understood how to use German technical superiority, how to position for maximum advantage, how to engage at ranges where Allied guns were useless against Panther armour. But on this August morning, technical superiority was an illusion about to be shattered by a stopgap British invention that would fundamentally alter the mathematics of tank warfare. Somewhere ahead, concealed in the hedgerows and orchards of Normandy, Sherman Fireflies from the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry waited with their ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder guns loaded with armour-piercing discarding sabot rounds. These were not the Sherman tanks Wittmann had learned to dismiss, the 75mm armed variants whose rounds bounced harmlessly off Panther frontal armour. These were the long-barreled exceptions, the British modified Shermans that German tank commanders had been specifically instructed to destroy first because they represented the only Allied tank capable of killing Panthers and Tigers at combat ranges. Wittmann had 12 seconds of life remaining. The engagement that would kill Germany's most celebrated tank ace began like dozens of others. Radio reports placed Canadian armour advancing through the smoke and dust of the bombardment. Wittmann positioned his Panther to engage, confident in the mathematics that had kept him alive through years of combat. A Panther's frontal armour could withstand hits from every Allied tank gun except under the most favourable conditions. German tactical doctrine emphasised this advantage. Engage at range, present frontal armour, use superior optics and gun to destroy Allied tanks before they could close to effective firing distance. It had worked on the Eastern Front against Soviet 34s and KV-1s. It had worked at Villers-Bocage against British Cromwells. It would work again today. Except it wouldn't. The 17-pounder gun that would kill Wittmann represented a revolution in British anti-tank capability, born from desperation and pragmatic engineering. The story began not on the battlefields of Normandy but in North Africa during 1943, when British tank crews first confronted the reality that their 6-pounder guns were becoming obsolete against newer German armour. The Royal Ordnance Factory had designed the 17-pounder anti-tank gun as the successor to the 6-pounder, creating a weapon with a 76.2mm bore and a 55 caliber barrel length that generated a muzzle velocity of 1,200 meters per second, with armour-piercing discarding sabot ammunition. On paper, the 17-pounder could penetrate 163mm of armour at 500 metres using standard armour-piercing capped rounds. With APDS ammunition, that penetration increased to 256mm at 500 metres and 233mm at 1,000 metres, figures that on paper could defeat the frontal armour of virtually every German tank at any combat range. The challenge was fitting this massive gun into a tank turret. The 17-pounder was designed as a towed anti-tank gun, long and heavy, requiring substantial modifications to mount in the confined space of a tank turret. British attempts to create indigenous tank designs mounting the 17-pounder, the Cruiser Mark 8 Challenger and the Cruiser Mark 8 Cromwell, experienced delays and difficulties that threatened to leave British armoured units equipped with guns inadequate for the German tanks they would face in France. The solution emerged through the persistence of two British officers who refused to accept that the 17-pounder could not be fitted to a Sherman tank. The technical challenge was enormous. The Sherman's turret had been designed for the 75mm M3 gun or the British 75mm gun. The 17-pounder was far longer and heavier, with a massive breech that simply did not fit the available space. Major George Brighty of the Ministry of Supply and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, the British chief instructor in gunnery, worked to overcome government reluctance and technical obstacles. Their solution required radical compromises. The co-driver position and bow machine gun were eliminated entirely, converting that space into ammunition storage. The radio was moved from its position behind the turret to the hull. The turret was modified with a cutout at the rear to accommodate the 17-pounder's recoil, creating an asymmetrical profile that would become the Firefly's distinctive visual signature. Even the gun mantlet had to be redesigned, creating the characteristic hump that helped identify Fireflies to friend and foe alike. Production began in early 1944 at the Royal Ordnance Factory in Nottingham. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, British and Canadian armoured units included Fireflies in their tank troops at a ratio of approximately 1 Firefly for every 4 or 5 standard Shermans. American tank units, despite being offered up to 217-pounder guns per month by the British, declined to adopt the weapon. American armoured doctrine did not prioritise tank versus tank combat, emphasising instead the Sherman's role in infantry support, where the 75mm gun's high explosive round was superior. Additionally, American 76mm and 90mm gun programs were already underway, and introducing another caliber would complicate logistics in an already complex supply system. The result was a stark divergence in capabilities. British and Canadian units entered Normandy with a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers frontally. American units did not. This capability gap would not become fully apparent to American commanders until July 1944, when Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's forces encountered Panthers in large numbers during the Normandy fighting and discovered that standard Sherman 75mm guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armour except at suicidally close ranges. The 17-pounder fundamentally changed the tactical mathematics of armoured combat in Western Europe. German tank doctrine since the introduction of the Panther in mid-1943 had relied on technical superiority. A Panther's 75mm KUK-42 L70 gun could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at ranges exceeding 2,000 metres. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun could only penetrate a Panther's frontal armour at ranges under 100 metres under ideal conditions, and even then, only the lower glacis or turret face, not the heavily sloped upper glacis. This meant Panthers could engage Shermans at ranges where return fire was impossible, picking off Allied tanks with impunity while remaining invulnerable to counterfire. But the Firefly inverted this equation. With standard APCBC ammunition, a Firefly could penetrate a Panther's gun mantlet from 2,000 metres and could punch through the lower glacis at closer ranges. With APDS ammunition, when available, a Firefly could theoretically penetrate even the Panther's upper glacis at ranges under 500 metres, though in practice, APDS accuracy issues limited effective range to approximately 500 yards. More importantly, the Firefly could penetrate a Panther's side armour from virtually any combat range and the turret sides from over 1,500 metres. This capability terrified German tank commanders who had grown accustomed to frontal immunity. Suddenly, positioning became critical in ways it had not been before. A Panther commander could no longer simply present frontal armour and engage at range. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He had to identify and prioritise Fireflies, had to destroy them first before they could bring their superior penetration to bear. German tactical instructions were updated to specifically identify Shermans with long barrels, and to engage them as priority targets before standard Shermans. The Firefly's distinctive long barrel became both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. German tank commanders learned to recognize the silhouette, to distinguish between the standard Sherman's relatively short 75mm gun and the Firefly's lengthy 17-pounder. British crews responded with camouflage and deception. They painted the protruding portion of the barrel with counter-shading patterns to break up its outline. They added false muzzle brakes to standard Shermans to confuse German gunners. They positioned Fireflies in hull-down positions, while standard Shermans advanced, using the less capable tanks as bait, while the Fireflies provided overwatch from concealment. Crew experiences in the Firefly varied from praise to complaint. The elimination of the bow gunner position meant Firefly crews consisted of only 4 men: commander, gunner, loader, and driver. This reduced crew size meant each man's workload increased. The loader's job became particularly demanding. A 17-pounder round weighed significantly more than a 75mm round, and the cramped turret, made even more confined by the massive breech and recoil mechanism, meant loading required physical strength and precise coordination. Ken Tout, who served as a gunner and later tank commander in the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry in Normandy, described the Firefly's characteristics in his memoir. The flash from the 17-pounder was so brilliant that both gunner and commander needed to blink at the moment of firing or risk temporary blindness. The muzzle flash was so intense that after a shot or two, hedgerows or undergrowth in front of the tank would start burning, revealing the Firefly's position and requiring immediate displacement to avoid counterfire. The recoil was severe, rocking the entire tank and temporarily disrupting aim. This meant the Firefly's rate of fire was slower than a standard Sherman's, approximately 3 to 5 rounds per minute, compared to the Sherman's 6 to 8 rounds per minute with the 75mm gun. Additionally, the powerful blast from firing kicked up enormous amounts of dirt and smoke, obscuring the gunner's vision and forcing the commander to observe the fall of shot and order corrections. Despite these limitations, the Firefly became perhaps the most valued tank in British and Commonwealth service in 1944. It represented the only reliable means of defeating Panthers and Tigers frontally, the only way to fight German heavy armour on something approaching equal terms. This value was recognized at the highest levels. A War Cabinet memorandum issued on July 20, 1944, proudly stated that Germans had nothing new to offer while the British Army was equipped with a number of new fighting machines, listing the Sherman tank with a 17-pounder gun first. General Bernard Montgomery wrote with confidence that reflected the Firefly's capabilities. "We have nothing to fear from the Panther and Tiger tanks. They are unreliable mechanically, and the Panther is very vulnerable from the flanks. Our 17-pounder gun will go right through them." Born from having a weapon that could actually kill German heavy tanks, represented a profound psychological shift from the near panic that had gripped Allied tank crews when they first encountered Panthers in significant numbers. The armour-piercing discarding sabot round that made the Firefly truly deadly represented cutting-edge ammunition technology that Britain had developed ahead of other nations. The concept was elegant in its physics. A conventional armour-piercing round consists of a projectile whose diameter matches the gun's bore. A 76.2mm gun fires a 76.2mm projectile. But this diameter limitation constrains the projectile's ability to penetrate armour, since penetration depends heavily on the pressure exerted per unit of area. A smaller, denser projectile travelling at higher velocity concentrates more energy into a smaller impact point, increasing penetration. The APDS round solved this problem through a simple but revolutionary design. The actual penetrator, the part that would strike and penetrate enemy armour, was only 50mm in diameter, much smaller than the gun's bore. This penetrator was surrounded by a lightweight sabot, a carrier that matched the gun's bore diameter and engaged the rifling to impart spin stabilization. When the round left the barrel, aerodynamic forces stripped away the sabot, discarding it, leaving only the small, dense penetrator to continue toward the target at extremely high velocity. The result was a 50mm projectile traveling at approximately 1,200 meters per second, carrying enormous kinetic energy concentrated into a small impact area. The penetration figures were impressive. Against vertical armor, APDS could penetrate 256 mm at 500 meters and 233 mm at 1,000 meters. Against the Panther's sloped upper Glacis, which presented an effective thickness of 139 mm when struck head-on, APDS theoretically had sufficient penetrating power at ranges up to 1,500 meters. In practice, several factors limited APDS effectiveness. Manufacturing variations in wartime production meant the sabots did not always separate cleanly, causing tumbling and accuracy degradation. British trials showed APDS accuracy was problematic beyond 500 yards, with significant dispersion that made hitting targets at longer ranges more a matter of volume of fire than precision shooting. Additionally, the 50mm penetrator, while excellent at punching through armor, created less post-penetration damage than a full-caliber 76.2mm round. The smaller projectile generated fewer spall fragments after penetration, meaning it was less likely to catastrophically destroy an enemy tank with a single hit. Crews sometimes needed multiple APDS hits to achieve a kill, whereas a single APCBC round that penetrated often proved immediately fatal to the enemy tank. For these reasons, APDS was not the miracle round some might imagine. It was a specialized tool for specific situations, primarily for engaging heavily armored targets at ranges where APCBC ammunition would not penetrate. Most Firefly crews in Normandy received only a limited allocation of APDS rounds, if they received any at all. APDS did not enter widespread distribution until August 1944, 2 months after D-Day, and even then remained relatively scarce compared to standard APCBC ammunition. The Firefly's combat debut on D-Day proved its value immediately, though the circumstances revealed Allied intelligence failures. Allied planning for the Normandy invasion had assumed German Panther deployment would be limited, similar to Tiger deployment. Intelligence estimates suggested Panthers were rare, heavy tanks assigned to elite formations, not the mass-produced medium tanks that would form a significant portion of German armoured strength. This intelligence failure meant Allied forces were unprepared for the reality. Approximately 38% of German tanks in Normandy were Panthers. British and Canadian forces, concentrated on the eastern flank around Caen, faced over 70% of the German armour deployed in Normandy, including the majority of elite Waffen SS Panzer divisions, equipped with substantial numbers of Panthers and Tigers. The Firefly's ability to engage these tanks on equal terms suddenly became not just valuable, but essential for survival. American forces, initially concentrated on the western flank, faced fewer German heavy tanks and did not immediately recognize the severity of the problem their standard 75mm armed Shermans faced. June 9, 1944, 3 days after D-Day, Lieutenant G.K. Henry's Firefly from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment demonstrated the weapon's capabilities during the defense of Nori-en-Bessin. Elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division attacked the Canadian positions with Panthers, attempting to exploit what they assumed would be Allied tank inferiority. Henry's Firefly engaged the attacking Panthers from a hull-down position, methodically destroying 5 Panthers in rapid succession. The engagement demonstrated both the Firefly's penetrating power and the importance of tactics. Hull-down positioning meant only the Firefly's turret was exposed, presenting minimal target to return fire, while allowing the 17-pounder to engage at effective range. June 13, 1944, at Villers-Bocage. Michael Wittmann's famous attack destroyed numerous British tanks, but the battle also demonstrated the Firefly's capability. When Wittmann's Tiger entered Villers-Bocage itself and engaged B Squadron, a Sherman Firefly commanded by Sergeant Bramall hit Wittmann's Tiger at least once, forcing him to withdraw from the town. The exact circumstances remain debated by historians, but multiple accounts confirm that Fireflies engaged Wittmann's Tiger and damaged it sufficiently to force his retreat. Later that afternoon, when German forces counterattacked to recapture Villers-Bocage, British Fireflies destroyed multiple Tigers and Panzer IVs, with Sergeant Brammel's Firefly credited with destroying at least one Tiger during the confused fighting. June 27, 1944, during operations near Roré Sea Squadron of an unidentified British armoured regiment equipped with Fireflies engaged German armour from the Panzer Lehr Division. Sergeant Dring's Firefly destroyed 4 German tanks in the engagement, and the squadron collectively destroyed 13 Panzer IVs, a Tiger, and a Panther, demonstrating that aggressive tactics combined with Firefly firepower could overcome German armour even when outnumbered. These early engagements established patterns that would continue throughout the Normandy campaign. Fireflies were typically positioned in overwatch positions, covering advances by standard Shermans. When German tanks appeared, the Fireflies would engage first, attempting to destroy or disable German heavy armour before it could effectively return fire. Standard Shermans would then advance to close range where their superior numbers and rate of fire could overwhelm surviving German tanks. German responses evolved as they recognized the Firefly threat. Tank commanders were specifically instructed to identify and engage Shermans with long barrels first. Anti-tank gun crews received similar instructions. The priority targeting of Fireflies meant their crews faced disproportionate danger compared to standard Sherman crews. British after-action reports noted that Fireflies suffered higher loss rates than standard Shermans when exposed to German fire, a consequence of being deliberately targeted. But the tactical advantage of having a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers frontally outweighed the increased risk. British armoured doctrine adapted to protect Fireflies while maximising their offensive power. Fireflies were positioned hull down whenever possible, exposing only the turret. They were often held slightly back from the main body of an advance, providing covering fire rather than leading the charge. When German armour appeared, standard Shermans would manoeuvre to fix the enemy in place, while Fireflies manoeuvred for killing shots. The psychological impact on German tank crews was profound and grew throughout the summer of 1944. German tankers had grown accustomed to frontal immunity against Allied tanks. The Panther's sloped armour and the Tiger's thick plate had provided a sense of invulnerability that shaped German tactical thinking. Crews could present frontal armour and engage at range, confident that Allied return fire would be ineffective. This confidence evaporated when facing Fireflies. German after-action reports and prisoner interrogations revealed a growing fear of Shermans with long barrels. Panther and Tiger commanders, who had previously engaged Allied armour with confidence, now approached every engagement with the knowledge that somewhere among the standard Shermans might be a Firefly capable of destroying their tank frontally. This uncertainty forced more cautious tactics, slower advances, more defensive positioning. The psychological advantage that German technical superiority had provided was being systematically eroded by a stopgap British modification to an American tank. The engagement ranges where Fireflies proved most lethal fell between 500 and 1,000 metres, a distance where the 17-pounder's accuracy remained reliable and penetration was guaranteed against Panther frontal armour. At these ranges, a Panther commander had approximately 12 seconds from the moment a Firefly gunner acquired his target until the armour-piercing round struck his tank. 12 seconds to identify the threat, 12 seconds to traverse the turret, 12 seconds to range and fire. German gunnery training was excellent. German optics were superior to British equivalents, but 12 seconds was often insufficient time to kill a Firefly before it killed you. The mathematics were unforgiving. A Firefly gunner who acquired a Panther at 800 metres would order the loader to select armour-piercing ammunition. The loader would extract the appropriate round from storage, a process requiring 2 to 3 seconds in the cramped turret. The gunner would centre the Panther in his sight, estimate range, and adjust for the target's movement, if any. This process required 4 to 5 seconds for an experienced gunner. The commander would confirm target identification and give the fire order. The gunner would fire. Total elapsed time from acquisition to shot, 7 to 9 seconds. The round would cross 800 meters in approximately 0.67 seconds. By the time the Panther commander recognized the threat, traversed his turret, and fired, the Firefly's round was already in flight. This temporal advantage meant that in engagements where a Firefly fired first, German return fire was often impossible. The armor-piercing round would penetrate the Panther's armor, detonate inside the crew compartment or engine bay, and disable or destroy the tank before the German gunner could bring his gun to bear on the Firefly. German tactical doctrine emphasized firing first, using superior optics and positioning to acquire targets before being acquired. But against Fireflies, this doctrine failed when British crews used proper tactics, positioning hull down or in concealment, waiting for German tanks to expose themselves before engaging. The sound of a Firefly firing became distinctive to veterans on both sides. The 17-pounder produced a sharp, powerful crack that differed noticeably from the deeper boom of the standard Sherman 75mm gun. German infantry and tank crews learned to recognize this sound and would immediately seek cover or call warnings over radio. The sound meant a Firefly was nearby, and that meant German armor was in danger. British infantry similarly learned to recognize the sound and took comfort in it, knowing their Firefly support could deal with German tanks that standard Shermans could not. The muzzle flash, brilliant and unmistakable, became both a signature and a liability. After firing, a Firefly's position was immediately revealed by the flash, and the resulting dust and smoke kicked up by the blast. Experienced crews would fire and immediately displace, moving to a new position before German return fire could arrive. This shoot and scoot tactic became standard doctrine for Firefly employment, trading the advantage of a prepared firing position for the safety of movement and unpredictability. July 19, 1944, British forces issued new instructions on fighting Panther tanks based on accumulated combat experience in Normandy. The document, distributed throughout British armoured units, reflected lessons learned through blood and steel over the previous 6 weeks. The Panther's upper front Glacis plate, previously considered essentially invulnerable, was now acknowledged as vulnerable to 17-pounder APCBC ammunition at close range. At 200 yards, a Firefly could knock out a plug of armour or even achieve complete penetration of the Glacis. The gun mantlet remained the primary aiming point at all ranges, with the 17-pounder capable of penetrating it from beyond 2,000 yards. The instructions also noted an unconventional tactic, firing high-explosive rounds at the gun mantlet. The resulting shockwave from the explosion would propagate through the armour, often shattering the roof of the driver's compartment and killing or incapacitating the crew even without penetration. Additionally, armour-piercing rounds of all calibers could ricochet downward from the gun mantlet and penetrate the thin roof armour, another means of achieving a kill without direct frontal penetration. These tactics reflected the accumulated knowledge of dozens of engagements, lessons purchased with destroyed tanks and dead crews. By late September 1944, penetration data was updated again to reflect the appearance of Panthers with thicker armour, specifically the Ausführung G model, with its 120mm thick gun mantlet, compared to the earlier 100mm version. Even against this improved armour, the 17-pounder with APCBC ammunition could penetrate the mantlet from beyond 2,500 yards when striking at normal incidence, or from 1,000 yards when striking at 30 degrees obliquity. The side armour of hull and turret could be penetrated from beyond 2,500 yards at normal incidence, or from 750 yards at angles up to 60 degrees. These figures translated to practical, tactical advantages on the battlefield. A Firefly positioned on the flank of a German advance could destroy Panthers from distances where German gunners could not even identify the Firefly as a distinct target. The Panther's excellent frontal armour became irrelevant when British tactics emphasised flanking manoeuvres and crossfire positions that exposed Panther sides to Firefly guns. German commanders found themselves forced into defensive tactics, presenting frontal armour, limiting maneuver, sacrificing initiative to protect against a weapon that could kill them from any angle at combat ranges. The human cost of this technological and tactical evolution played out in the Norman bocage throughout July and August 1944. Firefly crews lived with the knowledge that they were priority targets, that every German gun would aim for them first, that their distinctive silhouette marked them for destruction. Yet they also possessed the only weapon that could reliably kill German heavy tanks, making them indispensable to their squadrons and troops. This combination of danger and necessity created a unique psychological burden. Sergeant Gordon's crew from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment, a squadron, would bear this burden through the summer of 1944 and into the operation that would kill Michael Wittmann. Joe Eakins, Gordon's gunner, was a 21-year-old from Rushton, Northamptonshire, who had joined the army in 1942. By August 1944, Eakins had developed the steady nerves and precise gunnery that made him exceptional among Firefly gunners. His ability to acquire targets quickly, estimate range accurately, and fire with precision under pressure would prove decisive in the engagement that claimed Germany's most celebrated tank ace. Operation Totalize, launched on August 7, 1944, represented a massive Canadian-led offensive to break through German lines south of Caen and advance toward Falaise. The operation employed over 600 tanks and employed night attack tactics to minimize German defensive advantages. The 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry, equipped with Fireflies and standard Shermans, advanced as part of the British Second Army, supporting the Canadian assault. By August 8, the operation had penetrated German defensive lines, but faced stiffening resistance as German armoured reserves counterattacked. Michael Wittmann's presence on the battlefield that morning was itself a product of German desperation. The Schweres Panzer Abteilung 101, Wittmann's unit, had been withdrawn from the front after suffering heavy losses at Villers-Bocage and subsequent engagements. Wittmann himself had been resting in Germany, lionized by propaganda, promoted, decorated. His return to Normandy in late July had been part of a desperate attempt to stem the Allied breakthrough. The Tiger he had commanded at Villers-Bocage was no longer available, destroyed in the grinding attrition of the Normandy fighting. In its place, Wittmann received a Panther, technically inferior to the Tiger in armour protection but still formidable, still theoretically invulnerable frontally to Allied guns except the Firefly. The morning of August 8 found Wittmann's Panther positioned near the village of Garmesnil, approximately 3 miles south of Caen, in terrain that had been violently contested for 2 months. The Canadian offensive had begun before dawn with our heavy bombing, followed by armoured advances that threatened to break through entirely. German defensive positions were being overrun. Radio reports indicated Allied armour advancing in strength. Wittmann and other German tank commanders moved to engage, attempting to blunt the offensive through counterattack. The exact sequence of events that led to Wittmann's death remains debated among historians, complicated by conflicting accounts, lost records, and the chaos of battle. What is certain is that Wittmann's Panther, along with other German tanks, engaged Allied armour in the area around Gormesnil and Sintho. Multiple Fireflies from the Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment and the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry were operating in the area. The terrain offered limited concealment, mostly open fields with scattered hedgerows and small woods, conditions that favoured the side with superior numbers and tactical coordination rather than the side with superior individual tank performance. Joe Eakins, serving as gunner in Sergeant Gordon's Firefly, acquired a target at a range later estimated at approximately 800 to 1,000 metres. The target was a Panther, positioned to engage advancing Allied armour. Eakins identified the target as hostile, confirmed range, and fired. The 17-pounder's armour-piercing round crossed the distance in less than a second, struck the Panther's side armour, penetrated, and detonated inside the tank. The Panther's ammunition exploded catastrophically, blowing the turret from the hull. All 5 crew members died instantly. The entire engagement from acquisition to destruction took fewer than 10 seconds. Post-war research, including examination of German casualty records and the recovery of remains from the destroyed Panther, confirmed that Michael Wittmann died in this engagement. His body, badly burned, was identified through his scorched medals and insignia. He was 29 years old. His gunner, Balthasar Wall, who had served with him since Russia, also died in the explosion. 3 other crew members, men whose names were recorded in German casualty lists but whose stories remain largely unknown, completed the toll. The destruction of Wittmann's Panther by a Sherman Firefly represented a symbolic moment in the Normandy campaign, the death of Germany's most celebrated tank ace at the hands of the stopgap British weapon he had been trained to prioritize and destroy. But the symbolism extends beyond individual combat to the broader narrative of technological and tactical evolution in armored warfare. The Panther tank represented German belief in technical superiority as a war-winning advantage. The Firefly represented Allied willingness to improvise solutions, to modify available equipment rather than wait for perfect designs, to prioritize getting adequate weapons into service immediately over developing superior weapons eventually. This philosophical difference in approach characterized the broad Allied and German war efforts. Germany's pursuit of technical perfection in tank design, the emphasis on armor thickness and gun caliber and mechanical sophistication, produced tanks that on paper were superior to Allied equivalents. The Panther was better armored than the Sherman. The Tiger was more heavily armed. German optics were superior. German gunnery was excellent. But these technical advantages were overwhelmed by Allied industrial capacity, tactical flexibility, and willingness to accept imperfect solutions that worked well enough. The Firefly was not a perfect tank. It was cramped, uncomfortable, mechanically identical to the standard Sherman with all the reliability issues that implied. The muzzle flash revealed positions. The rate of fire was slower than standard Shermans. APDS ammunition had accuracy problems. Loading was difficult, but it worked. It could kill Panthers and Tigers. It was available in sufficient numbers by D-Day, and that adequacy, multiplied across hundreds of tanks, proved more decisive than German technical perfection in limited numbers. British and Canadian armoured units ended the Normandy campaign with approximately 540 Fireflies in service, distributed throughout their armoured formations at a ratio that ensured every tank troop had Firefly support. This distribution meant that German tanks faced Fireflies constantly, in every engagement, across the entire front. There was no sanctuary, no sector where German armour could operate with the assurance of frontal immunity. The psychological impact of this constant threat eroded German tactical confidence and forced increasingly defensive postures that surrendered initiative to Allied forces. American forces, lacking Fireflies, struggled with Panther engagements throughout the Normandy campaign. After-action reports repeatedly noted that standard Sherman 75mm guns could not penetrate Panther frontal armor except at suicidally close ranges. American tank crews developed flanking tactics, using superior numbers to fix Panthers frontally, while other Shermans maneuvered to side shots. These tactics worked but cost American tank units heavily in destroyed vehicles and casualties. The situation became critical enough that on July 2, 1944, General Dwight Eisenhower personally investigated American anti-tank capabilities after discovering that the M10 76mm tank destroyer, which had been left in England while M10s with the older 3-inch gun deployed to Normandy, could not penetrate Panther frontal armor. Eisenhower ordered tests using captured Panther hulls, firing various American guns at actual German armor to determine penetration capabilities. The results shocked American commanders. Only the British 17-pounder and 6-pounder with APDS could reliably penetrate Panther frontal armor at combat ranges. Eisenhower wrote urgently to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, demanding better ammunition and the 90mm gun that was being fitted to the M36 tank destroyer. The British offered to share Firefly production, but American forces declined for doctrinal and logistical reasons. Instead, American units would wait until September for the M36, with its 90mm gun, and until January 1945 for the M26 Pershing with its 90mm gun in a proper tank rather than a tank destroyer. Until then, American tank crews faced Panthers with inadequate guns and had to rely on superior numbers, aggressive tactics, and artillery support. The contrast between British and American approaches to the Panther threat illuminates different military cultures and doctrines. The British, scarred by experiences in North Africa where they had fallen behind in the tank development race, were determined not to repeat that failure. When intelligence indicated the Panther would be deployed in significant numbers, British commanders pushed the Firefly into production despite its imperfections, accepting compromises in crew comfort and design elegance to get a weapon capable of killing Panthers into service immediately. The Americans, operating under a doctrine that viewed tanks primarily as infantry support weapons rather than tank killers, believed their tank destroyers would handle German armour while Shermans supported infantry. This doctrine, developed when German tanks were primarily Panzer IIIs and IVs, proved inadequate when Panthers appeared in much larger numbers than intelligence had predicted. American commanders had to adapt tactics in the field, accepting higher casualties until better guns became available. The tactical lessons of Firefly employment in Normandy shaped British armoured doctrine for the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. The emphasis on positioning Fireflies in overwatch, using them for long-range precision fire rather than close assault, preserving them as valuable assets while standard Shermans bore the brunt of combat, all became standard practice. This doctrine acknowledged that not all tanks needed to be equally capable of killing heavy armour. A few specialised tanks with superior anti-tank guns, properly employed, could provide the decisive advantage needed to defeat German armour. This realisation influenced post-war British tank development. The Centurion, which entered service too late to see combat in World War II, incorporated lessons from Firefly employment. It featured the 17-pounder gun as standard armament, better armour protection, improved mobility, and a properly designed turret rather than the cramped modification of the Firefly. The Centurion represented what the Firefly had proven, that a tank needed sufficient gun to kill enemy heavy armour at combat ranges, sufficient armour to survive return fire, and sufficient reliability to remain operational under combat conditions. The German response to the Firefly threat evolved too slowly to matter strategically. Instructions to prioritize Fireflies were issued, but German tactical flexibility was constrained by fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and the grinding attrition that reduced experienced crew numbers throughout the summer and fall of 1944. Panthers that might have dominated the battlefield through technical superiority instead found themselves hunted by Fireflies, forced into defensive positions, their advantages in armour and gun negated by Allied tactical adaptations. The armour quality of late-war German tanks also degraded significantly, a fact that made the Panther's theoretical invulnerability increasingly illusory. Allied metallurgical analysis of captured Panthers revealed that armour produced in 1944 and 45 was increasingly brittle, prone to catastrophic failure when struck. The carefully hardened armour of early Panthers gave way to simpler homogeneous steel as German production struggled under Allied bombing and resource shortages. Armour that should have withstood hits instead shattered, sending lethal spall into crew compartments even when rounds did not fully penetrate. This degradation meant that late-war Panthers were more vulnerable than their specifications suggested. 17-pounder rounds that might have bounced off early production Panthers instead penetrated late production models. The effective protection of the Panther's Glacis, theoretically 139mm, was compromised by material failures that turned theoretical immunity into practical vulnerability. Firefly crews reported instances where rounds that should not have penetrated actually did, a testament to declining German armour quality. The broader narrative of the Firefly's impact extends beyond individual engagements to the strategic level. The presence of a weapon that could kill Panthers and Tigers frontally changed Allied operational planning. British and Canadian forces could plan offensives with confidence that their armour could engage German heavy tanks on approximately equal terms. This confidence permitted more aggressive operations, deeper penetrations, riskier manoeuvres. The psychological advantage shifted from German forces, who had enjoyed technical superiority, to Allied forces, who now possessed adequate tools for the job. August 8, 1944, the day Michael Wittmann died, also marked the beginning of the end of organised German resistance in Normandy. Operation Totalize, despite not achieving all its objectives, demonstrated that Allied armour could break through German defences even when facing Panthers and Tigers in significant numbers. The Falaise pocket would close in the coming days, trapping and destroying much of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army. The German forces that escaped would be shadows of their former strength, lacking the tanks, equipment, and experienced crews that had made them formidable. The Firefly's contribution to this outcome, while not solely decisive, was significant. It provided British and Canadian forces with the confidence and capability to engage German armour aggressively rather than defensively. It forced German tanks into increasingly cautious postures that surrendered initiative. It demonstrated that Allied industrial capacity and tactical flexibility could overcome German technical sophistication. And it killed the most celebrated German tank ace in circumstances that symbolized the broader trajectory of the war. German technical superiority, overwhelmed by Allied adequacy, multiplied through industrial scale. The Sherman Firefly remained in frontline service from June 1944 through the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. During those 11 months, Fireflies accumulated combat records that validated the British decision to prioritize getting an adequate weapon into service immediately rather than waiting for a perfect solution. Firefly crews destroyed hundreds of German tanks, including Panthers, Tigers, and the even more heavily armoured King Tigers that appeared in late 1944. The weapon that skeptics had dismissed as a compromise proved capable of defeating every German tank it encountered when properly employed. The advance from Normandy across France and into the Low Countries saw Fireflies consistently outperforming expectations. During Operation Market Garden in September 1944, Fireflies provided critical anti-tank support for British armoured columns, attempting to relieve paratroopers at Arnhem. When German Panther and Tiger tanks counterattacked the narrow corridor, Fireflies engaged them at ranges where standard Shermans were ineffective, destroying or disabling German armour and keeping the corridor open as long as tactically possible. The operation ultimately failed for strategic reasons, but Firefly performance was not among the failures. The winter of 1944–45 brought new challenges. During the Battle of the Bulge, American forces without Fireflies faced German armour, including King Tigers in the Ardennes forests where engagement ranges were often very short. British forces, positioned to the north of the German penetration, used Fireflies to blunt German armoured thrusts. The contrast between American struggles with inadequate guns and British success with Fireflies reinforced lessons about the importance of adequate anti-tank weapons in modern armoured warfare. January 1945 saw British forces advancing into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine and pushing toward the industrial heartland. Fireflies remained essential as German forces deployed their remaining Panthers and Tigers in desperate defensive battles. The British Army's official statistics recorded that Fireflies achieved kill-to-loss ratios significantly better than standard Shermans when engaging German armour, confirmation that the 17-pounder's superior penetration translated to battlefield success. Canadian forces, equipped with Fireflies throughout their advance from Normandy through Belgium and the Netherlands into Germany, compiled similar records. The 1st Canadian Army's War Diary entries repeatedly credit Firefly tanks with destroying German heavy armour, often noting that Fireflies engaged and destroyed Panthers at ranges where the Panthers had not yet identified the threat. This ability to achieve first-shot kills at long range remained the Firefly's decisive advantage throughout the war. Polish armoured units, equipped with Fireflies as part of British 21st Army Group, used them with particular effectiveness during the liberation of the Netherlands and the advance into Germany. The 1st Polish Armoured Division's combat reports noted that their Firefly crews developed exceptional gunnery skills, often destroying German tanks with the first shot. Polish tankers, many of whom had witnessed the destruction of Poland in 1939 by German armour, took particular satisfaction in wielding a weapon that could kill the tanks that had conquered their homeland. Czech crews in British service similarly employed Fireflies with distinction, their experiences adding to the accumulated tactical knowledge of how best to employ the weapon. The consensus that emerged from all these national contingents was consistent. Position Fireflies in overwatch or hull-down positions, use standard Shermans to fix enemy armour, allow Fireflies to engage from optimal positions with first-shot advantage. This doctrine, refined through hundreds of engagements, maximised Firefly effectiveness while minimizing exposure to return fire. The technical evolution of the Firefly continued even as the war approached its end. Improvements to APDS ammunition addressed some of the accuracy issues that had plagued early production. Better quality control in sabot manufacture reduced tumbling, dispersion. By early 1945, APDS accuracy had improved sufficiently that Fireflies could reliably engage targets at ranges approaching 1,000 yards, though APCBC ammunition remained preferred for most engagements due to its better post-penetration effects. Experiments with different ammunition types continued. Canadian forces tested APDS against fortifications, discovering that while the penetration was impressive against concrete, the small penetrator diameter limited effectiveness against reinforced structures. High explosive ammunition remained superior for attacking bunkers and pillboxes. But against armoured targets, particularly the King Tiger, whose frontal armour was effectively immune to standard Allied tank guns, APDS provided the only reliable means of achieving penetration at combat ranges. British trials of captured King Tiger tanks in late 1944 and early 1945 revealed that even the 17-pounder with APDS struggled against the King Tiger's 150mm frontal armour when striking at optimal angles. The King Tiger represented a level of armour protection that exceeded the Firefly's capabilities frontally, though side and rear armour remained vulnerable. These trials influenced post-war British tank development, confirming that future tanks would need even more powerful guns, leading eventually to the development of the 20-pounder and later the L7 105mm gun. The human cost of Firefly service remained high throughout the war. Crews understood they were priority targets, that German gunners would aim for the long-barreled Shermans first. British casualty statistics showed that Firefly crews suffered higher casualties per engagement than standard Sherman crews, a reflection of being deliberately targeted. Yet volunteers for Firefly service never lacked. The prestige of serving in the tank that could kill Panthers and Tigers, combined with the knowledge that they were protecting their comrades in standard Shermans, motivated tankers to accept the additional risk. Joe Ekins, the gunner who killed Michael Wittmann, survived the war and returned to Britain. He worked as a plasterer in civilian life, rarely speaking about his wartime service. The claim that he had killed Wittmann remained controversial for decades, with various individuals and units claiming credit for destroying Germany's most celebrated tank ace. Not until detailed research in the 1980s and 90s, including examination of German casualty records and battlefield archaeology, confirmed that Ekins's Firefly had indeed fired the fatal shot. Ekins received belated recognition for the engagement, though he consistently downplayed his role, noting that he had simply done his job as a gunner. Sergeant Gordon, Ekins's commander, also survived and returned to Canada. The Sherbrooke Fusiliers Regiment's war records, lost when an American aircraft accidentally bombed the vehicle carrying them shortly after the Wittmann engagement, meant that official confirmation of the kill took decades to establish. But Gordon and his crew knew what they had accomplished, and their memories, combined with German records and battlefield evidence, eventually established the historical record with reasonable certainty. The broader legacy of the Sherman Firefly extends beyond its combat record to its influence on tank design, philosophy, and doctrine. The Firefly demonstrated that specialized variants within a tank force could provide capabilities that need not be universal. Not every tank needed a 17-pounder if enough tanks had them to engage heavy armor when encountered. This realization influenced post-war armored doctrine in multiple nations. Mixed tank forces, combining tanks optimized for different roles, became standard practice rather than attempting to create a single, universal tank that excelled at everything. The Firefly also demonstrated the value of international cooperation in weapons development. The British gun, mounted in an American hull, employed by British, Canadian, Polish, and Czech crews, represented Allied cooperation in practical form. The willingness of nations to share technology, adapt foreign designs, and prioritize effectiveness over national pride contributed significantly to Allied victory. German reluctance to share technology with their allies, German insistence on German solutions to German problems, represented a contrasting approach that limited Axis effectiveness. Soviet forces, informed of Firefly capabilities through Allied liaison officers, drew their own conclusions about the need for more powerful tank guns. Soviet tank development in 1944 and 45 emphasized larger calibers and better armor penetration, leading to the D-10T 100mm gun and eventually the post-war development of larger calibers. The Su-100 tank destroyer, entering service in late 1944, could penetrate Panther frontal armor at 1,500 meters, providing Soviet forces with a capability comparable to the Firefly. The immediate post-war period saw the Firefly retired from British service relatively quickly. The Comet, entering service in late 1944 and early 1945, featured the 17-pounder in a purpose-designed turret with better armor and improved ergonomics. The Centurion, arriving too late for combat in World War II, rendered the Firefly obsolete. But the lessons learned from Firefly employment informed the design of these successor tanks and shaped British armoured doctrine for decades. Canadian forces retained Fireflies briefly after the war, but transitioned to American M4, a 3.8 Shermans, with the 76mm gun for post-war service. The Canadians concluded that while the 17-pounder had superior penetration, the improved Sherman variant offered better overall balance of capabilities for peacetime training and potential future conflicts. Polish and Czech units, absorbed into Soviet-dominated armies after the war, lost their Fireflies as Soviet equipment replaced Western weapons. The technical specifications of the Firefly, once classified military secrets, became publicly known in the post-war period as governments declassified wartime documents. Ballistic test reports, armor penetration tables, tactical employment manuals all entered the public domain and informed historical understanding of the weapon's capabilities and limitations. This documentary evidence, combined with veteran accounts and battlefield archaeology, created a comprehensive picture of the Firefly's development, deployment, and combat performance. Modern military historians assess the Sherman Firefly as one of the most successful expedient weapons modifications of World War II. It addressed a critical capability gap, provided reliable performance under combat conditions, and achieved results that exceeded initial expectations. The compromises required to mount the 17-pounder in the Sherman's turret, while significant, proved acceptable given the alternative of facing Panthers and Tigers with inadequate guns. Military effectiveness, not engineering perfection, determined success. The contrast between the Firefly's development timeline and German tank programs illuminates different approaches to weapons acquisition. The Firefly went from concept to combat deployment in approximately 1 year, rushed into production to meet an identified threat. German programs like the Panther II and E-series tanks consumed resources and engineering effort on progressively more sophisticated designs that never entered production before war's end. The perfect became the enemy of the good in German tank development, while British willingness to accept good enough enabled them to field effective weapons when needed. This philosophical difference in acquisition strategy had strategic implications beyond tanks. British willingness to modify existing designs, accept imperfect solutions, and prioritize rapid deployment characterized their approach across multiple weapons systems. German insistence on technical superiority, perfect engineering, and comprehensive testing before deployment limited the number and variety of weapons reaching frontline units. Both approaches had merits, but in the context of total war against an enemy with superior industrial capacity, the British approach proved more effective. The 12 seconds that separate a Firefly gunner acquiring a Panther target from that target's destruction represented more than just gunnery time. Those 12 seconds embodied the accumulated advantage of Allied industrial capacity, tactical flexibility, technological competence, and operational experience. The Panther tank, technically superior in armor and gun to the Sherman, could not overcome those 12 seconds because the entire system in which it operated was being overwhelmed by Allied advantages in other dimensions. Michael Wittmann's death on August 8, 1944, symbolized this broader reality. The man celebrated as Germany's greatest tank ace, destroyer of 138 enemy tanks, holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, died because a 21-year-old British gunner in a converted Sherman fired first and hit accurately. Wittmann's skill, his Tiger and Panther tanks' technical superiority, his tactical knowledge, none of it mattered in those 12 seconds. The system that produced Joe Eakins and his Firefly defeated the system that produced Wittmann and his Panther. The broader narrative of World War II tank warfare follows this pattern. German technical sophistication produced tanks that on paper were superior to Allied equivalents. But Allied industrial capacity, tactical adaptability, operational flexibility, and willingness to accept adequate solutions defeated German perfection through overwhelming numbers and sufficient quality. The Sherman Firefly exemplified this approach. Not the best possible tank, but a good enough tank available in sufficient numbers when needed. The lessons of the Firefly remained relevant long after the weapon itself passed into history. Military forces worldwide studied the Firefly's development and employment, drawing conclusions about acquisition strategy, technological adaptation, and tactical doctrine. The Israeli Defense Forces, facing Soviet-built tanks in the hands of Arab armies in the 1960s and 70s, employed similar logic. Upgrade existing tanks with better guns rather than wait for new tank designs. The Israeli modifications of Sherman tanks with French and British guns directly echoed the Firefly concept. The Firefly's place in popular military history grew in the post-war decades as veterans published memoirs, historians analyzed declassified documents, and enthusiasts preserved surviving examples. Several Fireflies exist in museums worldwide, their distinctive long barrels and modified turrets drawing attention from visitors who recognize the weapon's significance. Tank restorations have brought some Fireflies back to running condition, allowing modern audiences to see and hear the 17-pounder fire, experiencing something of what German tank crews faced when encountering these weapons. The controversy over who killed Michael Wittmann, finally resolved in favor of Joe Eakins and the Sherbrooke Fusiliers, illustrated the challenges of establishing historical truth in the chaos of combat. Multiple units engaged German armor that day. Multiple Fireflies fired at Panthers. The fog of war obscured immediate clarity. Only decades of research, comparing Allied and German records, examining the battlefield, and analyzing the physical evidence of Wittmann's destroyed Panther, established what happened with reasonable certainty. Even now, some dispute the conclusion, but the preponderance of evidence supports Eakins as the gunner who fired the fatal shot. The human dimension of the Firefly's story encompasses thousands of crew members who served in these tanks from June 1944 through May 1945. They were British, Canadian, Polish, Czech, volunteers and conscripts, professionals and amateurs, united by their assignment to a weapon that could kill German heavy tanks at the cost of being priority targets for every German gun. Their collective experience, compiled in after-action reports, memoirs, and oral histories, provides rich detail about the reality of armoured combat in Northwest Europe. Crew accounts consistently emphasise several themes. The cramped turret, even more confined than standard Shermans due to the 17-pounder's size. The difficulty of loading ammunition in combat, wrestling heavy rounds into the breech while the tank manoeuvred and the gun recoiled. The blinding muzzle flash that temporarily destroyed night vision and obscured targets. The necessity of immediate displacement after firing to avoid counterfire. The satisfaction of destroying Panthers and Tigers, knowing they had achieved kills that no standard Sherman could accomplish. The fear of being identified by German gunners, knowing their long barrel marked them for prioritized destruction. These experiences, individual yet remarkably consistent across nationalities and units, created a shared identity among Firefly crews. They were the tank hunters, the Panther killers, the crews with the gun that could do what others could not. This identity brought both pride and burden. Pride in their capability and importance to their unit's success. Burden of knowing their survival depended on perfect execution of tactics that provided thin margins for error. 12 seconds, sometimes less, separated life from death. The technical specifications that made these 12 seconds possible deserve final emphasis. The ordnance quick-firing, 17-pounder gun, 76.2 mm in caliber, 55 calibers in length, generating a muzzle velocity of 1,200 meters per second with armor-piercing, discarding sabot ammunition. Penetration of 256 mm of vertical armor at 500 meters, 233 mm at 1,000 meters. These numbers translated to the ability to penetrate a Panther's Glacis, turret, and sides at combat ranges. Numbers that meant Firefly gunners could fire with confidence that their rounds would penetrate, that their shots would be effective, that German armor was not invulnerable. The Panther's armor specifications, impressive yet ultimately insufficient, provided the context. 80 mm of frontal Glacis armor sloped at 55 degrees, creating an effective thickness of 139 mm, 100 mm of turret front armor. 40 mm of side armor. These figures had made the Panther nearly immune to Allied tank guns in 1943. By mid-1944, the Firefly negated that immunity. The technical specifications that promised German superiority were overcome by British engineering that mounted a gun capable of defeating them. The strategic impact of this technical and tactical evolution cannot be overstated. Allied forces advanced from Normandy to Germany in 11 months, from June 1944 to May 1945. This rapid advance occurred despite facing German forces equipped with tanks that on paper were superior to Allied equivalents. The Firefly, deployed in sufficient numbers and properly employed, was one factor among many that enabled this advance. Not decisive alone, but contributing significantly to the overall result. The human cost of achieving this victory remained sobering. British and Canadian armoured forces suffered thousands of casualties during the Northwest Europe campaign. Firefly crews, as priority targets, contributed disproportionately to these statistics. For every Panther destroyed, Allied tanks were lost, crews killed or wounded. The arithmetic of attrition favoured the Allies because they could replace losses while Germany could not. But each individual loss represented tragedy for families and units. Victory was purchased with blood and steel, with young men dying in burning tanks, with families receiving telegrams announcing deaths in places whose names they could not pronounce. Michael Wittmann's death, while symbolically significant, was one loss among thousands Germany suffered as the war turned inexorably against them. His replacement in German propaganda's narrative of heroic resistance highlighted the desperation of a regime whose military forces were being systematically destroyed. The celebration of individual ace tankers, like the celebration of individual fighter pilots, reflected the reality that Germany lacked the industrial capacity to match Allied production. Individual excellence could not compensate for systemic weakness. The final battles of World War II in Europe saw Fireflies continuing to engage German armour until the last days. The last Panther destroyed by a Firefly occurred in early May 1945, days before German surrender, a final punctuation to a campaign that had demonstrated the weapon's effectiveness consistently. When hostilities ended on May 8, 1945, Firefly crews could reflect on 11 months of combat that had validated every design compromise, every tactical adaptation, every risk accepted. They had done what was needed. They had provided the gun that could kill Panthers and Tigers. They had contributed to victory. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.